The rusted gates of Blackwood Asylum groaned open, a sound like a dying animal. Our bus, a wheezing behemoth of faded yellow, rumbled through. Crumbling brick buildings, their windows like vacant eyesores, stretched into the oppressive gloom of an overgrown courtyard. We were on a historical field trip, or so Principal Thompson had cheerfully proclaimed, to what was once the most notorious mental institution in the state, shut down decades ago for practices so barbaric even the state government deemed them excessive. That was a polite way of saying they tortured people to death in here. "All right, kiddies," Mr. Abernathy, our bus driver, boomed, his voice unnaturally jovial. "Last stop before we hit the history books. Blackwood Asylum, where the crazy came to get crazier." He chuckled, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floor of the bus. I shivered, not from the chill in the air, but from the unsettling way his eyes glinted in the rearview mirror. They were too bright, too eager. There were 8 of us. Sophia, with her perpetually bored expression and perfectly manicured nails. Tyler, the resident jock, already flexing his biceps for an audience of precisely no one. Claire, the bookworm, clutching a tattered copy of something by Poe. Joseph, the class clown, unusually subdued. Amy, constantly texting, oblivious to the oppressive atmosphere. Edward, the quiet artist, already sketching the decrepit architecture in his notebook. Anthony, always the one who felt things too deeply, who saw the shadows others ignored, and then there was me, Jacob. "This place gives me the creeps," Sophia muttered, pulling her designer scarf tighter around her neck. Tyler snorted. "Relax, it's just an old building. Probably full of rats and cobwebs." "And ghosts," Claire added, her voice a hushed whisper. "They say the screams of the patients still echo in these halls." Mr. Abernathy killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of my own heart. He turned in his seat, a wide, unsettling grin plastered on his face. He was a big man, well over 6 feet, with a thick neck and hands like shovels. His uniform, a faded blue, was surprisingly clean, but a faint, metallic odor clung to him, something I couldn't quite place. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its forced joviality. "We've got about an hour here. Stick together. Don't wander off. And for God's sake, don't touch anything." He paused, his gaze sweeping over each of us, lingering for a beat too long on my face. "Especially not the remains." A nervous ripple went through the bus. "Remains?" Joseph asked, his voice cracking. Mr. Abernathy's smile widened, revealing a flash of something too white, too sharp. "Just a joke, son. Get out there, enjoy the history." We stumbled out of the bus, into the heavy, stagnant air of the asylum grounds. The silence pressed in on us, a suffocating blanket. The sun, once a pale comfort, now seemed to cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and twisted, mimicking unseen horrors. The main building loomed before us, a multi-story monstrosity of decay. Broken window panes glittered like shattered eyes, and vines, thick as python coils, strangled the crumbling brickwork. "This is insane," Amy muttered, finally looking up from her phone. "Why would they send us here?" "Because it's educational," Claire said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's important to remember the dark parts of history, so we don't repeat them." We followed Mr. Abernathy towards the main entrance, a massive, ornate wooden door, scarred and warped with age. He produced a set of rusty keys from his pocket, each one larger than my hand. The lock, when he finally found the right key, shrieked in protest as it turned, echoing through the desolate courtyard. The moment the door creaked open, a wave of cold, stale air washed over us, carrying with it the undeniable scent of decay, of dust, and something else. Something metallic and sickly sweet. Blood. The thought flashed through my mind, unbidden and terrifying. Inside, the light barely penetrated. Long, dark corridors stretched out, disappearing into an inky blackness. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, punctuated by scattered debris, broken medical instruments, splintered furniture, and what looked like rusted restraints. The walls were stained with various shades of brown and crimson, like grotesque abstract paintings. "Welcome to Blackwood," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice a low rumble in the oppressive silence. "Watch your step. And remember, no wandering." He led us through a cavernous reception area, past a desk covered in what looked like patient records, their brittle pages yellowed with time. We moved into a long hallway, lined with doors on either side, each one numbered. The air grew colder with every step, and the metallic scent grew stronger, almost overwhelming. Suddenly, Claire gasped. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a dark stain on the wall, roughly the size of a human torso. It was a deep, rusty brown, and it shimmered faintly in the dim light. "Just old water damage," Mr. Abernathy said dismissively, his eyes scanning the corridor. But it wasn't water damage. It was too uniform, too dark. It looked like a body had been pressed against the wall, leaving behind a grim silhouette. We continued our macabre tour, Mr. Abernathy pointing out various points of interest with an unsettling enthusiasm. He showed us the hydrotherapy room, where patients were allegedly subjected to ice-cold baths and high-pressure sprays. The rusty tubs were still there, grotesque relics of a torturous past. Then there was the lobotomy ward, a room filled with rusted operating tables and an array of unsettling tools. My stomach churned. This wasn't a historical field trip, it was a descent into hell. As we walked, I noticed something else. The doors to the patient rooms weren't all open. Some were still tightly shut, and from behind a few of them, I could swear I heard faint scratching sounds, or the softest, most unsettling whimpers. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just the wind, or my overactive imagination. But the sounds persisted, a terrifying counterpoint to Mr. Abernathy's droning commentary. Suddenly, Amy shrieked. "What was that?" she cried, pointing to a dark corner. A rat, fat and gray, scurried across the floor, disappearing into a hole in the wall. Tyler chuckled, but the sound was forced. Even he looked unnerved. "Just a rat, sweetheart," Mr. Abernathy said, but his eyes were darting around too, a strange glint in them. We finally reached what Mr. Abernathy called the recreation room, a large, open space with broken windows and a few overturned chairs. The light was better here, streaming in through the shattered glass, illuminating the decay in stark detail. In the center of the room, there was a large, circular stain on the concrete floor, so dark it looked like a black hole. "This is where they held the dances," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice suddenly thick with something I couldn't quite decipher. "To reintegrate the patients. Sometimes, the dances got a little wild." He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was then that I noticed it. In a dim corner, partially obscured by a pile of rubble, was a small, crudely made doll. Its head was sewn on crookedly, and its button eyes seemed to stare directly at me, a silent accusation. My heart pounded. This wasn't a prop. This was too real, too personal. "All right, that's enough of this place," Sophia said, her voice unusually subdued. "Can we go now? I'm starving." Mr. Abernathy turned, his wide smile returning, but it felt even more unsettling now. "Starving, are we, dear? Well, I do have something special planned for lunch." Something in his tone, and the way he lingered on the word special, made my blood run cold. I glanced at the others. Sophia was still focused on her hunger, Tyler was trying to look bored, Claire was lost in her thoughts, and Joseph was nervously picking at a loose thread on his shirt. Only Edward, who had been sketching silently throughout the tour, looked up, his eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a shared understanding, a dawning horror. We started to walk back towards the entrance, the silence even heavier now, punctuated only by the scuff of our shoes on the dusty floor. The metallic scent was overpowering, making my head spin. I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it didn't help. As we neared the reception area, Mr. Abernathy suddenly stopped. "Oh, dear," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "It seems I've dropped my keys." He bent down, his back to us, pretending to search the floor. And then, he moved. Not a search, but a lunge. He grabbed Joseph by the collar, hauling him up effortlessly. Joseph screamed, a sound of pure terror. "Mr. Abernathy! What are you doing?" Tyler yelled, stepping forward. But Mr. Abernathy was too fast. He twisted Joseph around, exposing his neck. And then, with a sickening squelch, he bit into Joseph's throat. The scream choked off, replaced by a gurgling sound as blood, warm and bright, gushed from the wound, painting Mr. Abernathy's face and uniform a grotesque crimson. Joseph's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief and unimaginable pain, before they glazed over, and he went limp in Mr. Abernathy's grasp. Silence. A horrifying, absolute silence, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of Joseph's blood hitting the dusty floor. Mr. Abernathy pulled away, his face a mask of ravenous satisfaction, his teeth stained crimson. He licked his lips, a slow, deliberate movement, his eyes, those unnervingly bright eyes, fixing on us. "Lunchtime," he purred, his voice low and guttural, no longer the jovial bus driver, but something ancient and monstrous. "And it seems you're all on the menu." Sophia shrieked, a high, piercing sound that ricocheted through the asylum halls. Tyler, for all his bravado, stood frozen, his face ashen. Claire dropped her book, her hands flying to her mouth. Amy was still staring at her phone, but her fingers were trembling. Edward, surprisingly, was the first to react. "Run," he screamed, shoving me forward. We scattered, a desperate, panicked flight. Sophia bolted towards the main entrance, her heels clattering on the concrete. Tyler, finally snapping out of his stupor, followed her, his long legs pumping. Claire, her face streaked with tears, stumbled after them. Amy, still in a daze, just stood there, her phone slipping from her numb fingers. "Amy! Run!" I yelled, but it was too late. Mr. Abernathy, moving with an unnatural speed for a man his size, lunged for her. She didn't even have time to scream before he tackled her to the ground, a sickening thud echoing through the hall. I heard a choked cry, followed by the wet, tearing sound of flesh. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran, propelled by a primal terror, deeper into the asylum, Edward right beside me. We pounded down a long corridor, the sound of our frantic footsteps swallowed by the vast emptiness of the building. The air was thick with the stench of blood and decay, making every breath a struggle. "Which way?" I gasped, my lungs burning. "I don't know," Edward yelled back, his voice strained. Just away from him. We burst into a large, circular room, clearly an old recreation area. It was filled with broken furniture, rusted toys, and what looked like a makeshift stage. Sunlight, filtered through grimy windows, cast long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. Over there! Edward pointed to a narrow doorway on the far side of the room, half hidden by a collapsed bookshelf. We scrambled over the debris, our hands and knees scraping against the rough concrete. The doorway led to a dimly lit stairwell, spiraling downwards into the oppressive darkness. Basement? I whispered, my voice hoarse. Better than staying up here, Edward replied, his voice grim. We descended into the cold, damp depths of the asylum. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of mildew and something else. Something foul and unidentifiable. The stairs creaked under our weight, each sound amplified in the suffocating silence. We reached the bottom, plunging into near total darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its weak flashlight beam cutting a pathetic swathe through the gloom. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, storage rooms filled with rotting crates, and what looked like old boiler rooms. Pipes, thick with rust, snaked across the low ceiling, dripping a viscous, brown liquid onto the concrete floor. This is insane, I whispered, my voice trembling. He's going to find us. We need to find an exit, Edward said, his voice surprisingly steady. There has to be a way out of here. We moved cautiously, our flashlight beam dancing across the grimy walls, revealing disturbing glimpses of the asylum's hidden horrors. In one room, a pile of what looked like surgical tools lay discarded, glinting eerily in the dim light. In another, a child's rocking horse, missing an eye, sat forlornly in a corner, rocking almost imperceptibly as if an invisible child was still playing. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from somewhere above us. It was Sophia. A horrifying, drawn-out wail that ended abruptly, leaving a void of agonizing silence. My blood ran cold. She was gone. Tyler was probably next. He's upstairs, Edward said, his voice tight. We need to move faster. We continued our desperate search, the silence above us now replaced by the unsettling sounds of movement. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming closer. Mr. Abernathy was hunting us. We stumbled into a large, open space, a sort of subterranean infirmary. Rusty stretchers were lined against the walls, and a few wheelchairs, their spokes broken, lay overturned. In the center of the room, there was a large, tiled slab, stained with what looked like ancient blood. This is probably where they did the operations, Edward whispered, his face pale in the faint light. As we stood there, trying to catch our breath, a new sound emerged from the darkness. A soft, guttural moan. It wasn't human. Not exactly. It was too low, too animalistic. My heart pounded against my ribs. What was that? Edward's eyes widened. I don't know. But it's not Mr. Abernathy. The moan came again, closer this time, followed by a faint scraping sound. We froze, our breath held, listening. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the infirmary. It was a man, but barely. His clothes were tattered rags, his skin a sickly gray, stretched over skeletal features. His eyes, sunken and vacant, stared blankly ahead. He was emaciated, almost skeletal, and his movements were jerky, unnatural. He shambled towards us, dragging one leg, a low, continuous moan escaping his lips. Oh my God, I whispered, my voice barely audible. A patient. This wasn't just a rundown asylum. It was still inhabited. The patient shuffled closer, his vacant eyes seeming to fix on us. He raised a gnarled hand, his fingers long and bony, adorned with broken, yellowed nails. "Get back!" Edward yelled, picking up a rusted metal pipe from the floor. The patient didn't react, just kept shuffling forward, his moan growing louder, more desperate. He reached us, his outstretched hand clawing at the air. I could see the fresh wounds on his arms, festering and oozing. He smelled of decay and something else. Something that made my stomach churn. Edward swung the pipe, striking the patient's arm with a dull thud. The patient let out a guttural cry, a sound of pain, but he didn't stop. He just kept coming, his movements surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "He's not normal," I screamed, backing away. "No kidding!" Edward grunted, swinging the pipe again, this time hitting the patient's head. The impact was sickening, a wet crunch of bone. The patient stumbled, his head lolling at an unnatural angle, but he still didn't fall. He just kept moaning, his vacant eyes still fixed on us, a grotesque parody of life. Then, from the darkness behind him, another figure emerged. And another. And another. They were all like the first, emaciated, clad in rags, their movements jerky and unnatural, their moans filling the air with a symphony of despair. They were the patients of Blackwood Asylum, and they were still here. "They're still alive," I whispered, a horrifying realization dawning on me. "They never left. We need to go," Edward yelled, pulling me back towards a narrow archway, partially obscured by medical screens. We scrambled through, the sounds of the moaning patients growing louder behind us. The archway led to a series of even smaller, darker rooms, each one more disturbing than the last. In one, a rusty straitjacket hung from a hook, swaying gently in an unseen breeze. In another, a padded cell, the walls stained and scarred, reeked of stale urine and desperation. As we navigated the claustrophobic corridors, the air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet that I now knew was blood. And then, we heard it. A familiar, chilling chuckle. Mr. Abernathy's voice boomed from somewhere close by, amplified by the close quarters. "Look what we have here. Little mice, playing in the walls." Panic seized me. He had followed us. He was down here. And he wasn't alone. The moans of the patients grew louder, closer. They were everywhere. A soft scratching sound started from within our tiny closet. My blood ran cold. It was coming from the floor, just inches from my foot. I fumbled for my phone, flicking on the flashlight. The beam illuminated a small hole in the concrete, barely visible before. And from the hole, a pair of dull, unblinking eyes stared back at me. A rat. A huge, diseased-looking rat, its whiskers twitching. I stifled a scream. Then, a new sound, one that made my blood run even colder. A faint, wet-ripping sound, followed by a soft, satisfied grunt from Mr. Abernathy. He was feeding. He was eating someone. The image of Joseph, his throat torn open, flashed in my mind. Then Amy, tackled to the ground. And Sophia, her scream cut short. Tyler. Was he still alive? Or had he become part of Mr. Abernathy's gruesome meal? The sounds of chewing grew louder, interspersed with the sickening squelch of flesh being torn. My stomach rebelled, and I fought to suppress the urge to vomit. Edward's hand, clammy and cold, gripped my arm. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He'll find us." "Where do we go?" I whispered back, despair creeping into my voice. "They're everywhere." The moans of the patients were getting closer, and I could hear the distinct sound of their shuffling feet right outside our closet door. They were drawn by the smell of blood, by the raw, primal energy of the kill. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the main basement area. Mr. Abernathy roared in frustration. "You idiots," he bellowed. "Stay back. She's mine." It sounded like the patients were interfering with his feast. Maybe they were drawn to the scent of the fresh kill, an instinctual, animalistic hunger. "Now!" Edward hissed, wrenching open the closet door. We burst out, our flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The patients were indeed converging on the scene, a grotesque tableau of starvation and madness. They were clawing at Mr. Abernathy, their emaciated hands reaching for the mangled remains of his latest victim. He was fending them off, swinging his arms, but they kept coming, a silent, hungry horde. This was our chance. "This way!" Edward yelled, pulling me down a narrow, unlit corridor I hadn't noticed before. We ran, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence, the sounds of Mr. Abernathy's enraged shouts and the patient's guttural moans fading behind us. This corridor was different. It was cleaner, less cluttered, and the air, though still stale, wasn't as thick with the scent of decay. Suddenly, a faint light appeared ahead, a sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness. We ran faster, our lungs burning, our legs aching. The light grew, revealing a rusted metal door, half obscured by overgrown weeds. "An exit!" I gasped, my voice filled with desperate hope. Edward flung himself at the door, pulling at the rusty handle. It groaned in protest, but it held firm. "It's stuck," he grunted, straining against it. "Try again," I urged, my heart pounding. We could hear the sounds of pursuit growing closer. The patients were coming. Edward braced himself, put his shoulder to the door, and shoved with all his might. The metal shrieked, and then, with a loud bang, it gave way. We tumbled out into the blinding sunlight, gasping for breath, our eyes squinting against the sudden brightness. We were in a small, overgrown courtyard, clearly a neglected service entrance. A crumbling brick wall, topped with barbed wire, stretched around the perimeter. Beyond it, a dense forest. "The bus!" I cried, remembering. It was still in the main courtyard. But there was no way we could get back to it. "No time!" Edward yelled, already scrambling towards a gaping hole in the wall, where the barbed wire had rusted through. "We need to get into the woods." We crawled through the jagged opening, our clothes tearing on the sharp edges, our skin scraped and bleeding. The forest was thick, dark, and unforgiving, but it was salvation. We plunged into the dense undergrowth, running blindly, our hearts pounding, the image of Mr. Abernathy's blood-stained face and the moaning patients burned into our minds. We ran until our legs gave out, until our lungs screamed for air, until the sounds of the asylum faded into the distance, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. We collapsed against a tree, gasping, shaking, covered in dirt and blood, both ours and others. Silence. A blessed, fragile silence. "Are we safe?" I whispered, my voice raw. Edward, his face pale and streaked with grime, just nodded, his eyes wide and haunted. "For now." We stayed there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows through the trees. The chill returned to the air, and with it, the unsettling realization that we were stranded, miles from anywhere, in the middle of nowhere. As darkness fell, the sounds of the forest began to merge with the horrors of the asylum. Every rustle of leaves sounded like shuffling feet, every distant hoot of an owl sounded like a guttural moan. My mind replayed the gruesome scene: Joseph's scream, Sophia's desperate shriek, Amy's lifeless form. Their faces, contorted in terror, flashed before my eyes. "We have to call someone," I said, pulling out my phone. "No signal." "Of course." "We need to walk," Edward said, his voice grim. "We have to find a road, anything." We began to walk, deeper into the dark embrace of the forest. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me. The forest itself seemed to conspire against us, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms, its roots tripping us in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we saw it. A faint glow in the distance. A road. Hope surged through me, a desperate, exhilarating rush. We stumbled towards it, our legs burning, our bodies screaming in protest. We emerged onto a narrow, unlit road, barely more than a dirt track. It was deserted. No cars, no lights, just the endless expanse of the forest on either side. "Now what?" I said, despair creeping back in. "We walk until we find something," Edward said, his voice grim but resolute. "We don't have a choice." We walked for what felt like miles, the chilling silence of the night broken only by the chirping of unseen insects and the pounding of our own hearts. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound a potential threat. My mind was still reeling from the horrors of the asylum, the images of Mr. Abernathy and the patients burned into my memory. Then, in the distance, a flicker of light. Headlights. A car. "Look!" I cried, pointing. We started to run, waving our arms, desperate for help. The car approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating our disheveled, blood-stained forms. It slowed, then stopped. A woman in a pickup truck, her face etched with concern, peered out the window. "Are you two all right?" she asked, her voice kind. "You look like you've been through hell." We were. We had. We climbed into the truck, collapsing onto the worn seats, the warmth of the heater a small comfort against the lingering chill of the asylum. We tried to explain, stumbling over our words, the story too horrific to fully articulate. She listened, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. We told her about the bus driver, about the asylum, about the patients. She drove us to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place that seemed impossibly normal after what we had endured. The police were called, and we repeated our story, over and over, to skeptical officers who looked at us with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They went to Blackwood Asylum. They found the bus, abandoned, bloodstained. They found evidence, but they didn't find Mr. Abernathy. And they didn't find the patients. No one believed us about the patients. They said it was impossible, that the asylum had been empty for decades. They chalked it up to trauma, to shock. But we knew. We had seen them. Their vacant eyes, their shuffling forms, their guttural moans. They were still there, trapped in the decaying halls of Blackwood, the living dead. We were taken to the hospital, treated for cuts and scrapes and given sedatives to help us sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Joseph's torn throat, Sophia's desperate scream, Amy's lifeless form. I heard the chilling chuckle of Mr. Abernathy, the endless moans of the patients. Life went on, but it was never the same. Edward and I were survivors, bound by a shared nightmare. We never spoke of it to anyone else, not really. Who would believe us? The world preferred to believe that Blackwood Asylum was just a rundown building, a historical relic, not a tomb filled with hungry cannibals and forgotten souls. But sometimes, when the night is silent and the shadows lengthen, I can still hear them. The faint, guttural moans echoing in the darkness, a chilling reminder that some horrors never truly die. And I wonder, in the deepest, darkest corners of my mind, if Mr. Abernathy is still out there, driving his bus, looking for new passengers, for a fresh lunch. And if, in the depths of Blackwood Asylum, the forgotten patients still wander, waiting for new company, for someone to join them in their eternal torment.
But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, maybe you'll get sick of being the